My grandfather told me this story one afternoon while I sat beside his bed at the hospice he was dying in, interrupting himself every other few seconds with wet coughs into a handkerchief. Lung cancer. His mind was still sharp but cloudy. I could tell that sometimes when I visited him that he struggled to fully remember who I was. I would have never heard this story had he not already had one foot in his grave. His mind was going fast by then, and he often mistook me for my father, who was long gone by then. Once he thought I was his brother, my great-uncle, and excitedly gripped my hands while he told me all about how he regrets never making amends with me, his brother, before he died in the war. The war. Vietnam. The afternoon that I heard the story, I came in and sat down while my grandfather stared at the television on the opposite wall. The news was on, and though my grandfather was staring at it, I could tell he wasn't really watching. "James," he said, "why did we never go back to help?" My name isn't James, and I wasn't aware of anyone in my family named that. Grandpa?" I asked. My grandfather rolled his bloodshot eyes over to me. He was stick-figure thin. The skin on his face looked so taut that you could make out the skull underneath. "We could have gone back and saved them." He coughed weakly. "We didn't. Why?" I don't know, Grandpa," I said. "Because we were weak and scared. That's why. Me and you. What the fuck were we thinking?" This took me aback. I never heard my grandfather curse besides the occasional "God damn it" when frustrated. "I'm scared of dying," he said flatly. "I'm scared of what I will see on the other side, if there is another side." A crucifix was laying on his chest as he said this. I had always thought my grandfather a devout Catholic. I felt like I had to say something. "You'll be okay, Grandpa. Grandma is waiting for you in heaven." My grandfather chuckled. "Don't patronize me. You and I know if that God exists, he is one sick bastard. Why would he be so kind to reunite us? The good go to hell and the bad go to heaven. If he exists, that's how he would do it." I regretted coming that day by then. Clearly my grandfather was in a lucid state. Perhaps what he was speaking wasn't what he actually thought, but I felt like it was. He had let his guard down. He snapped his eyes back to me. "We know," he exclaimed gruffly. "We saw those fucking things, and what did they do? Do I have to remind you?" I was stunned. Grandpa, please." He settled back down into bed with a sigh. "Who are you?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, and he spoke before I could. "I need to tell you what happened out there. I don't want to die alone with this knowledge." Do you need..." He shut me off with a grunt. "Don't talk. Listen," he started. "Of course, I didn't go to college to save my ass. When the draft started, I knew my name would be on the list, and I did nothing to stop it. I could have gone to Canada, but I didn't. I could have joined the Guard, but I didn't. I just let it happen. So when I got the card in the mail, I wasn't surprised or sad. I just accepted it. I heard all sorts of horror stories the months leading up to my deployment. I heard stories of Vietnamese savages feasting on the flesh of dead soldiers. I heard about quicksands that could swallow you so quick you couldn't even yell for help. I heard about tales about black magic that aided the Vietnamese soldiers. It was all horseshit, of course, but it still got under my skin. So by the time I was deployed, I always felt on edge. I was more scared of shamans than I was of getting shot in the head while pissing in a ditch. For the most part, being out there in the jungle and the grass fields that went on forever was just boring. Lots of dope helped a bit. Playing cards well into the night, but no action. We would pass some civilians every now and again, and we could have shot them if we wanted to. Headquarters didn't care. We never did, though. We weren't bloodthirsty, at least not in the cold-blooded variety. By the time it fucking happened, we were almost begging to come across some poor Vietnamese saps with an outdated machine gun. At least then we would have an excuse to kill so we could sleep at night. Over there, things just fucked with you. You didn't need dope. You just needed boredom and all those damn bugs. My grandfather closed his eyes for a few minutes at this part, and I thought he had gone to sleep and wouldn't finish the story. But much to my surprise, he started talking again. I've read a lot about the paranormal and all that. I was looking for anything to help me explain what happened that night. None of it helps. It's all horseshit. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves. Who the hell knows if these things are real? I know what's real. It happened to me. There were 8 of us. We had been together for about 6 months by then, and we all considered ourselves brothers. It's hard to not grow close to the only people you spend company with for over half a year. We set up our camp for the night and we were just shooting the shit, playing cards and smoking dope. We were bad soldiers, that was for sure. But none of us cared. We all came to the conclusion that the war was pointless. We were spending billions on some little proxy war that amounted to a dick-measuring contest. So we didn't care about all the technical military shit. Any half-competent Viet Cong regiment would have killed us all easily. But we didn't see them. At least, never mind. The jungle around us was pitch black, and only our lights would have alerted anything or anyone for miles of our presence. Stupid. So goddamn stupid. Marvin heard it first. A crack. Someone or something was just outside our camp, walking heavily. I noticed him noticing it in almost a comedic fashion. His eyes jumped open to the size of dinner plates, and he swiveled his head back and forth. "Guys," he hissed between his teeth. We all stopped talking and listened. We all heard it too. Multiple things were making noise around us. The sound of snapping twigs and leaves. We all shot up, suddenly alert, our rifles in hand, nearly all of us with bad trigger discipline. "Oh shit," I heard Joe say. Oh shit. Then we saw it. Coming from the brush was a Viet Cong soldier, walking jerkily and strangely and without noise. "Fuck!" I heard someone yell. Then suddenly the night was full of deafening gunfire and the smell of gunpowder. Our bullets tore through the man, and I saw vividly the top and bottom half of the man's face explode off of him. Everything below his eyes became a gory red mess. His neck exploded into red tatters, and his head fell to the side like his neck was a broken door hinge. But he kept walking. I heard screaming to my side, and I looked to see another Viet Cong soldier grab Marvin by the neck. I realized I hadn't fired my gun at all. I was too shocked. Devin spun around, and before I could tell him no, he fired at the Viet Cong soldier, grabbing Marvin. Devin's bullets tore through Marvin and into the soldier. Marvin's torso riddled with friendly fire. The soldier threw the body with incredible force at Devin, who fell to the ground from the dead weight. I saw the soldier who grabbed Marvin was also riddled, a large bullet hole above his eye that had caused a fist-sized hole at the top of his head. He should have been dead, but he wasn't. He wasn't. He kept walking. He kept fucking walking. My grandfather's voice had risen at this point, and he was becoming agitated, but I was too stunned to console him. More were coming, and I turned to see one was holding Joe and literally ripping him apart. The screams he made, they'll be the last thing I ever hear. I swear. A hand grabbed me by the shoulder, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I pissed myself. But it was just James. I turned around to look at his face. He looked oddly calm, but I looked at his eyes and I could see the animalistic instinct in them. He had shut himself down and given himself over to instinct. "We need to fucking go," he said. Everything else was a blur. All I could hear was James's voice and the ringing in my ears. He turned and ran, and I followed. The others fought those things while we ran like the cowards we are. We could have stayed and been good soldiers and fought, but we ran. I couldn't think of a response. Everything he had said so far was too fantastical to believe. Was this story the product of a cancer-addled brain? I refused to believe it's real. I leaned over to say something, but my grandfather reached out and grabbed my hand. "Don't let me die," he said. Their eyes were black. "Don't let me die." He closed his eyes. That was the last interaction I ever had with my grandfather. He died 2 days later. His story weighs on me like a pile of bricks, sometimes late at night, and I often find myself staring at my ceiling thinking about it. I wish he never told me. I know this story will be very hard to believe. I still have doubts about it, but I do trust my wife's uncle. He served in the army following so many after September 11th, but he had an experience that may separate him from so many others. He experienced a monster in an abandoned town in Iraq, and it seems to have stayed with him all the way to today. Years ago in Iraq, my wife's uncle served for a short time and was discharged after severe trauma. Sure, he had some physical trauma, but it took a long time to figure out the mental trauma as well. He was always so silent about it, but a couple days ago, he finally told me his story about this town. I don't remember the exact name of the town, but he said there was no one there. He told me how the town was not that large, looked pretty old, and was probably abandoned years ago. But he found one man that seemingly still lived there. He and a couple of others followed him into the town to find other people that may have been living there, but nobody seems to live there. But one of the men discovered what could only be described as a human slaughterhouse. Blood covered the walls of one house, so much blood, but more than can be found in any one person. They investigated the house, and most of the blood was old, but some looked relatively fresh. They realized that despite all the blood, there seems to be bodies, which was odd, so they looked all around until their eyes fell on this hole that led to a cave. The cave was massive and looked very well carved. There was a foul odor that permeated the air, and it didn't take long to find the source, nor did it take long to find the missing bodies. They looked down and found bodies everywhere. It looked like something from a horror movie. As they looked around, they saw writing all over the walls. Nobody even knew what language it was, but it looked like maybe some kind of Hebrew or some other old Middle Eastern language. They started to hear someone coming, and they got themselves positioned and ready for whatever may come. The footsteps got louder and louder, but nobody was showing up, until they finally saw a silhouette. A massive figure stood at the entrance. It stood maybe 10 feet, maybe taller. My wife's uncle is about 6'2", and he said he felt so small, he was like a child next to this thing. It let out a blood-curdling sound, drawing the men out. But it did something nobody expected. It spoke. "I am the son of Serael, a son of heaven. Now come face me." The men stood as the creature stared at them. He went to his side and pulled out what looked to be a spear. He pierced one man, who bled out very quickly. Then he grabbed another man and took a large bite out of him. He screamed for what seemed like an eternity until he just went silent. My girlfriend's uncle decided to start shooting at the monster, but bullets didn't seem to work. He looked so human despite his size, yet his skin seemed more tough than any animal he had seen. He then took an idea he remembered from the Bible, of the story about David and Goliath, except the rock is a bullet. So he took aim at his head, and multiple rounds went through the monster's eyes, and blood was gushing and the monster screamed, so he ran from the beast. He explained what he saw and what happened to the other men to his superior officer, but he was shocked with papers. He had to promise Uncle Sam that he would remain silent about these events. It's as if the government knew what was happening and they were just covering it up. How many others live out there? And what are they? Who is Serael? I had so many questions, and even the man who was there had no answers. Again, I know this all sounds far-fetched, and that you may think I'm just making up some story, or I could even just be gullible. But believe that him and I believe there are large humanoids that live in the Middle East that are just savages. I was deployed to Afghanistan for my second tour on my wife's birthday. This fact was all I could think about lying awake every night in that unfortunate country. I cannot describe the existential frustrations that come from day-to-day of sadness, sensual destruction, brutal heat, and fatigue in that godforsaken war. This, combined with the catastrophic reality of the dreaded IED, improvised explosive device, and of course, the creatures. Swarms of insects, camel spiders, sandflies, snakes, and scorpions. You'd find them in your clothes, your boots, or on your floor, and they'd scatter in the night when you turned on a flashlight. But at least I was safe from those fucking IEDs in our camp. My troop lived in a small, burnt-out schoolhouse in a small village southeast of the capital of Kabul. The province we occupied was ravaged from months of insurgent fighting. Most villagers fled, but a few remained behind and stayed mostly indoors to avoid roaming groups of Taliban patrolling the area, looking for food or donations to charity. Those that refused to help, or worse, were identified as cooperating with Afghan national or American forces, were beaten or even killed. Even the young people stayed at home. Although we encountered the almost daily harassment of small arms fire, the peppering of bullets hitting the walls of the schoolhouse, the nights were eerily calm. Local insurgents had improvised a strict curfew on everyone in the area, even themselves. From 6 in the evening until morning prayers. The Taliban terrorized the locals, and the presence of foreign troops only aggravated the fighting. Assassinations and kidnappings became daily news, in addition to an increasing number of victims being caught between the fighting between Afghanistan National Security Forces and insurgents. To counter the expansion of government presence, anti-government elements used targeted kills to intimidate local influential elders. This deliberate targeting of civilians led to an increase in suicide attacks, IED attacks, and assassinations. It was the last type that took the life of a highly esteemed member of the High Peace Council one fateful day, gunned down inside his own home. The attack ripped apart his body, but his face was left perfectly, peacefully even, intact. The killing caused an uproar. Being a distinguished leader in the village, it was of the utmost importance to the residents that his body be prepared for a proper religious burial. A challenging task, as there was no longer anybody left at the health clinics or mosques. The local coroner, a religious man, had fled to Kubal months previous to the attack. In a brave effort of goodwill, my troop decided to make the dangerous trek to Kubal to send for the coroner. The journey would take at least 10 hours by combat vehicle, and the men decided it would be best to sneak out after nightfall during curfew. There was just one thing. Somebody had to stay behind to guard the corpse. Being terrified of a possible IED attack along the way, and not particularly bothered by the sight of a dead body, I was comfortable with death at this point. I volunteered to stay behind. Besides, I had a flask of low-grade, locally made, contraband liquor to keep me company. There's a strong superstition of witchcraft among the local tribe the deceased man had belonged to. To be fair, it isn't locally referred to as witchcraft, but this is the best cultural translation I can offer. There's an ancient belief that local witches rifle graves and funeral pyres in search of bones, and cut pieces of flesh from unburnt corpses to use for blasting their neighbors' lives. and that some of these old sorceresses, the moment they smell death anywhere about, hastily mutilate the corpse before mourners even arrive. It is said that these witches even have the power to change their shape. They turn into spiders or mice or snakes or even flies, disguises they can use for stealing flesh. Most of us would recognize this as symptoms of normal decomposition, but this superstition held strong in that particular region. For this reason, I was tasked by the locals to watch attentively the whole night. I promised to fix my eyes on the corpse without even a sideways glance. I respected the locals and wanted to grant them what little peace I could. The guilt I felt being involved in this war constantly overwhelmed me. Here was an opportunity for penance. The man's widow, one of the only women left in the village, led me into the man's room, where she showed me the corpse lying on a slab and wrapped in an off-white linen shroud. After a fit of weeping, she called in a man as a witness. Together, as if taking inventory, they examined the features of the man's face to record that it was undamaged. Then they left me alone in the room with nothing but a large lamp for the evening. All alone with the corpse, I fortified my eyes for the vigil by rubbing them hard and keeping up my spirits by talking to myself between pulls on my flask. Twilight turned into night, and night grew deeper and deeper, blacker and blacker, more quiet and then silent, until my usual bedtime had passed and the midnight approached. I had only been a little uncomfortable at first, but after some time passed, I began to feel thoroughly frightened. Perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me, as it often did these days. At one point in the evening, a small desert mouse squeaked in through a hole in the door, stopped near me, and fixed its gaze intently on me. The boldness of this stupid little mouse was disconcerting, but I quickly shooed it away. Sometime after this, a sudden and deep sleep took over me and dragged me down into a bottomless dark gulf of sleep. This was the deepest sleep I had experienced since enlisting in the war. Usually my mind was so frantic I could barely sleep. I don't even know how to describe it to you. I had clearly been running on a deficit up until this point, and my body finally just crashed. I didn't dream at all. I felt nothing at all. If someone had walked into the room right then, they couldn't have readily discerned which of us two was the corpse. The body on the slab, or the body passed out on the floor. It was almost as though I had actually died and my corpse had been left without a guardian. Many hours passed like this, and I finally woke up to the sun rising and the sound of morning prayers. Quickly remembering my post, I rushed to the body in a bit of a panic. I pulled back the shroud and examined the corpse's face closely. To my huge relief, I found it untouched. No bugs or creatures had gotten into it the night before in my stupor. A short time later, the man's widow came into the room, still weeping, with a witness behind her. She threw herself onto the man and, after kissing him tenderly, brought my lamp close to his face to make sure all was well. Delighted with my local service, she turns to me to express her gratitude. Before she could gesture, a terror took over her face. The woman screamed and turned away from me. In my confusion, I put my hand to my face. It felt like wet, ground meat. Somehow, in my deep sleep, I hadn't noticed sandflies eating at my face, completely disfiguring me. Today, it looks like I'd suffered third-degree burns, caused by enemy gunfire or an explosion. I will never tell anybody the horrible truth of my wound, which haunts me to this day.